Now, again, I'll start with a couple of questions, but we will open this from the floor. We want to take your questions as well. But one thing I noticed as I read your biographies, you both entered into public life, at least in elected life, in 1964. 1964, Senator Lugar was elected to the school board in Indianapolis. Representative Hamilton elected to the Congress first in 1964. Of course, that election year, 1964, was a very divisive election, a landslide election for the Democrats, Lyndon Johnson against Barry Goldwater. Don't want to draw too many parallels from history, but we're in a divisive year this year as well. You spoke about some of those issues earlier today. But as you reflect back on when you were starting in public service, you were starting in public life with the aspirations to serve, with the aspirations to be in public office, could you have imagined you'd end up where you are today? I mean, what's the perspective you have as you look back over that career? And how are the 60s maybe similar or different than what we see today?
No, I could not imagine. But I think that 64 was a beginning year for me in the primary of 64 as opposed to the general election. The school board was in the May election of that time. And it came about largely because I was out at a factory, Thomas L. Green Company, which my grandfather had founded. Things were heading to the rocks about 1960 when I came back from the Navy. And my brother came from Purdue. He had some engineering background. I had liberal arts, Oxford and what have you. But we spent all of our time trying to turn the business around, and were successful, building our employment up from 50 to 100 and exporting machinery to Mexico and then to South America, finally to the Philippines. But one day, about 3 or 4 years after I arrived at the factory, a group of elderly people on the west side, industrial west side of Indianapolis, came to the factory, and they said, "Lugar, you've got to run for the school board. Our kids are just getting dirt out here. We are just always on the short end of the stick. And somebody's got to fight for them." I still remember vividly an elderly lady piped up, "You're far too young, but we're about all we can see we've got out here." And so you'll have to do. But in any event, my wife, Char, very wisely said, "Our 4 boys are going to go to the public schools. You better find out what's going on there," because we hadn't paid that much attention given the turnaround of the factory and all of that. And what was going on was the beginning of a civil rights revolution, really. As I filed to run, so did a lot of other people. It was a pell-mell situation that had never been seen in a school board election before. Somehow I emerged. An African-American lady, Gertrude Page, whose husband had died in the inner city, a coal dealer, got the most votes. I got the second most. And this started a bipartisan coalition of sorts, but we were trying to deal with school lunches, first of all, before we got into the desegregation of the schools. Very controversial. The Chamber of Commerce condemned everything we were doing. So the Indianapolis News. It was not an auspicious start. And this was all going on during the 64 election year in Indianapolis and elsewhere. So I mention this because very frequently people ask, well, how do you get started in politics? How do you know which office is going to be? In my case, I would never have thought the school board, didn't know where they met, quite apart from exactly what they did. But nevertheless, it was a beginning, and a very exciting one.
Started with school lunches, and then from there, it just blossomed, and now you're doing global food aid.
Yes.
So you're kind of in the same business.
Yeah. Expanded.
Yeah.
Well, the first request I have is to cover up that periodic table of the elements. I used to look at that 60 years ago, didn't understand it then, and I certainly don't understand it today. Makes me nervous to be in the same room with it. There's a lot of luck in politics. Most politicians don't acknowledge that. I happened to run for Congress in 1964 when any fool on the Democratic ticket could get elected, and several did. Johnson ran in as you mentioned, a landslide. and I came in on his coattails. You asked about the difference. One real difference then was that people generally, I think, thought government could do good things. I don't think that's the case today. I think the attitude towards government's role has changed a good bit. But we passed the so-called Great Society programs, much criticized but never repealed. Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to education were the big issues when I went into Congress. And of course, they're still on the books. They've had to be adjusted and corrected, amended, and have been frequently. But they're still on the books, and I don't think they're going to be repealed. I had both negative and positive reasons for running for office. The other day I was at a law school and they asked me why did I go into politics. And I told the law students I got bored practicing law, which is true, but was not exactly a diplomatic thing to say in the law school. But I did. I was bored practicing law. And I was getting more and more interested in politics. That's kind of the negative side of it. I went into politics not because I thought I could change the world. I didn't have that thought at all. But I wanted to make a contribution to the direction and the success of my country. Nothing more than that. And I did, and feel like we've had some progress in politics and in government. You have a lot of defeats, and you have some victories. And if you can't take a defeat, don't get into politics because you're going to get it. But it is also very rewarding. So I would conclude the opening remarks by saying that I hope all of you will sit down someday and figure out where you can make a contribution to your community, to your society, to your country. There are all kinds of ways to do it. Dick began on a school board. You don't have to be in an elected office to do it. You can serve on a board or do a lot of different things as a citizen. But I would go so far as to urge some of you to run for office. I think it's enormously challenging. I don't think you can find another profession that is more challenging. It brings you into contact with a greater variety of people than any other profession I can imagine. And it's very satisfying. Even when you lose the battle, it's satisfying because you've taken a shot at it. And when you win a few, I don't know what more you could do to help people. I'll give you one quick illustration. I mentioned Medicare. I voted on Medicare, one of the first votes I cast in the spring of '65. I didn't have a thing to do with it. Didn't draft it, didn't argue for it, never spoke a word on the floor of the House on that bill, just voted for it. And I've found it very satisfying because I think it's done a lot of good in the country. So you have deep satisfactions on all kinds of things. I won't tell you about the defeats. Okay.
That idea of taking a lot of shots even if you miss them. You are an old basketball player, right?
That's right.
Basketball Hall of Fame in Indiana, 1982.
It's the only way I got
inductee.
elected to Congress.
Right. You have to have something to start with. Good. All right. Now, we do want to take
I
questions.
also had short hair and they thought I was a Marine.
Oh, that's a good call. If there's questions from the audience, just raise your hand and we'll start here. Go ahead.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll try, but I don't think I understand it. The Budapest Memorandum. Okay, back to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Security assurances.
Well, it's an important question because certainly many people in Ukraine would feel let down that the Budapest covered them. I suppose that the dilemma was a practical one, that essentially the government of the Ukraine was, I wouldn't say incompetent, but filled with corruption, but not a very good operating situation. And the real problem was how to stop the Russians, who were clearly indicating they were not there, but they were there, even if not in uniform, and flying aircraft over and what have you. But it's a good question. We could have taken the position that we had a military responsibility to take on the Russians. And the Russians are denying that they're there, but we're saying you are there. And the murky aspect of this made it very difficult for whoever the decision makers were, whether you believe they were right or wrong. As it stands, why the United States is still trying to work with our NATO allies to prop up the government of Ukraine, hoping that it will continue to reform a little bit. And some days there seems to be progress, others not so much. I've had some people who have come to my office now in the Lugar Center who were parliamentarians from Ukraine. Very interesting insights. Two of them were military people who had been out there. And I asked them, what really is the feeling of the people who are involved in this struggle in the eastern part of the country? And they admitted about 50-50. A good bit of Russian heritage, Russian speaking, and not altogether unhappy that given what they feel are the frailties of the Ukraine government, that the Russians might provide something better for them.
One observation I'd like to make on that, Putin is pretty smart. He understood that he could go into the Crimea and the United States would not respond militarily. He also knew that he could go into or he thought, and thought correctly, that he could go into the eastern Ukraine and the United States would not respond militarily. Now, we came in with sanctions and that sort of thing. It was a crafty move, calculated, but smart from his point of view. And it put us in a tough spot, still does.
Good. Yes, Dr. Messer. So of all the presidents you served under or with, who was most bipartisan and why? What was their secret?
Well, I served under every president. I've worked with every president since Lyndon Johnson. Now, Johnson had overwhelming Democratic majorities. And of course, he had a legislative record of considerable accomplishment, had a lot of problems in Vietnam. So I'm not sure I'd put him up as a bipartisan leader. There are some incidents of bipartisanship that I think were extraordinary. One was Jimmy Carter on the Panama Canal. And the fellow who saved it for him was Tennessee Senator
Howard Baker.
Howard Baker. Mm-hmm. Carter was on the ropes trying to get the 2/3 vote to ratify the treaty. And Howard Baker stepped up and said, I'm going to support it. And his influence in the Senate was enough to swing it with the Democratic votes and some Republicans as well. You know, Nixon had quite a legislative accomplishment record, often overlooked because of the troubles he got into later. But Nixon was quite willing to work with the Congress. He came out of the Senate, of course, and he knew it pretty well. He's a very smart guy. And his accomplishments in legislation were considerable, and I think largely bipartisan. Almost every president needs bipartisan support at some point in his presidency. And they're quite willing to reach out, usually, I think, in a pragmatic way to get the majorities they need. But no one president really stands out to me in that respect.
I would comment that President Ronald Reagan was the president that appeared to me to be offering greatest bipartisan listening and support and action. And he did so really by inviting a lot of people to come to the White House. This is something that has been overlooked by some presidents who realized that they needed the support of the Congress, but on the other hand, were not willing in day-by-day activity to spend that much time with members of Congress. Not just lobbying them, but even providing a forum like this one that we're having today, for example. President Reagan did provide a lot of opportunities. And these are reflected in many of the positions that he took. So that gave some confidence to members of Congress who came to the White House and who participated in all of this. I would also echo Lee's thought about President Nixon. Despite the ending of his time in a very inglorious fashion, President Nixon was very pragmatic when it came to foreign policy and really eager to try out all sorts of things. I can remember the first visit that President Nixon made outside of Washington was to Indianapolis when I was mayor. It was the second year of his administration. The first year he had stayed in Washington because of Vietnam protesters in many places, and he didn't want to get into conflicts of that sort. His advisor said, "You really got to get outside," and he came to Indianapolis, and 20,000 people greeted him there on the city-county plaza, but there were sharpshooters in all the buildings around there, and he was palpably relieved to get off the stand and into the city-county building. But on the way up to the 25th floor, he said, "Lugar, I want you to go with Moynihan to Brussels. There's going to be a meeting of NATO on cities. And I want the two of you to go over there." And so that began a series of events, literally, because Nixon was interested in what Pat Moynihan at least had to say, who was a very close advisor in the White House during that administration, long before he became a senator. And I exercising considerable daring, I thought at the time, invited all the mayors of the world to come to Indianapolis the following year. I called it the first international conference on cities. And Nixon did not come, but he sent Agnew, at least to indicate that he was interested in the whole situation. But he had a good number of byplays in that respect, and that was true for other members of the Republican Party, and quite apart from members of Congress.
Presidents do not get to choose the environment they work in, and they do not get to choose the Congress they have to deal with. So presidents can have to accept the political realities that they're in and try to figure out the best way to get done what they want to get done. So they're pragmatic presidents. They look at that Pennsylvania Avenue, the Congress looks like a big obstacle to them, and usually is, but they've got to figure out a way to deal with it as best they can. I think President Obama came into office wanting to work across the aisle. He was not successful at that. You can blame him or you can blame the Congress as you choose, but the fact is it didn't work. And so he turned more and more to unilateral action. And that was a pragmatic decision on his part. May be right, may be wrong, but it was a decision. Most presidents have to figure out what they're dealing with and charge ahead.
Just to follow up on this, you mentioned that Lyndon Johnson had Democratic majorities. You mentioned Ronald Reagan, and oftentimes Reagan's relationship with Tip O'Neill, when Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House, is cited. But on the other hand, the House had been under Democratic control for over 40 years. What other option would Reagan have had? Is this the situation as you talk about, or is it the person deciding in their own style that they're going to try to build bridges rather than stand off?
Well, I think the Reagan-O'Neill partnership, in some ways it was that, is very instructive. O'Neill, the great liberal from the Northeast, Massachusetts, Reagan, the great conservative from the West. Both of them ardent partisans. Reagan could give a terrific speech for the Republicans. O'Neill could do it for the Democrats. But when they sat down together, the premise was we have to make this country work. We've got to come to a conclusion on the problem in front of us. And so they would wheel and they would deal. I sat in on a number of those meetings, and they got, the tensions would rise, but they never got uncivil with one another. And they always ended up the session by trying to top one another on who could tell the best Irish joke. They were both very skillful politicians. They didn't give in easily, but they recognized the power structure they were dealing with, and they recognized that in order to get anything done, they had to wheel and deal and compromise and negotiate. Incidentally, I drove up here on I-69. The deal on I-69 was struck by a number of us with Tip O'Neill. Tip wanted the big dig in Boston. In other words, he wanted to put an interstate highway right through the middle of Boston. That costs a little money, incidentally. Putting a tunnel under a whole city. Those of us from the Midwest on down to Texas wanted an interstate highway from Detroit to Texas. We got Tip O'Neill's support for that if we supported the big dig. You wouldn't have I-69 if that deal hadn't been struck. Now that may repulse you, but you got to make deals or you don't get anything done. And you're the beneficiary.
Good question. Yes.
I'm sorry.
You had mentioned earlier today a more benign foreign policy on the part of the United States, and yet the student Hannah sees a more isolationist ideal growing in America. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think we've had some tough experiences. Iraq, Afghanistan did not turn out as well as we would like. We spent a lot of money and are still spending a lot of money in those areas. And we've been disappointed. So you did not have, I mentioned the period of Lyndon Johnson, you had a certain confidence in what government could do, both in foreign policy and domestic. Here, the American people have been unimpressed with our ability to get things done in foreign policy. And you have stagnation at home. You have people, the American economy is not working very well today for an awful lot of people. And they're disappointed. That's the populist sentiment we've seen rise in the politics this year. So you put these things together and the American people say, look, why spend all that money in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere? Why spend all this money that we need to be the leader of the world when we got so many big problems at home and we don't have good jobs for a lot of people? And that tends to make them more inward looking. I shy away from the word isolationism. The way I would describe it is that I think the American people are very ambivalent about the leadership role of the United States. They're proud of the fact that we're number one. They like to see the United States as the leader. But at the same time, they wonder about all the money it takes and lives that have to be expended or have been expended. And so they draw back. And incidentally, this makes it tough for the politician. He or she has to deal with that environment. The American people being ambivalent. Now, Dick and I are both internationalists. We believe in the American leadership role in the world. And we've both encountered a lot of people within our own party who do not enthusiastically support that position. So I think it's ambivalence.
I would just comment that even though we don't seem to know as an administration or a Congress what to do in the Middle East, we have been very active for now a few years in the Pacific. The so-called pivot to Asia has produced not only a lot of fleet excursions out there, but some real shoring up of confidence in South Korea and Japan, and even on Australia, who have taken on some United States Marines that are out there, in addition to our troops being in South Korea and Japan. Now, this is not often commented on, but this is a very big part of the population of the world. If you include India into that situation. And so we have, then skeptics would say, well, why not do something about North Korea then? Why not get the Chinese to help out? Well, that's a long stretch for the Chinese, to say the least. And furthermore, we as a country are not sure what we want to do about North Korea, except to try out maybe some more economic sanctions, which probably don't have much effect upon the young leader there. We have similar problems with the rest of the business of Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey, ISIS, the whole business. And the president has decided, at least this administration, would simply play on the margins. We would have troops training people over there. We'd provide some aircraft strikes. We would do some things that didn't have too many boots on the ground, the prospects of Americans being entrapped. And certainly the big argument is, if you did have success, are you prepared to stay and govern the place? Well, we're not. For a while we thought we were in Iraq or in Afghanistan or so forth, but eventually we become weary of governing people who really don't want to be governed by us, even though we claim that they like our democracy idea, liberation of women, lots of other things of that sort. So this is, the next administration hopefully will have a better solution, but but this is why it sort of gets kicked around in this area. While the American fleet is still very active, and we've shored up NATO, and in essence, the United States still is sort of holding it all together.
Let me just emphasize that. America today is prosperous, secure, and free. There are vast areas of the world where American foreign policy is working pretty well. Northeast Asia is one of them. And there are big problems everywhere, of course. But by and large, you and I are living in a pretty good time to be Americans. We don't have any country in the world that comes close to us in strength, no matter how measured. America's in a pretty good spot. We got our problems, but don't sell us short.
Yes, Dr. The question is whether that idea of the pivot toward Asia, is America shirking her responsibilities to get involved in specifically Syria, you mentioned, and other situations like that and other trouble spots in the world?
Syria is really the problem from hell. How do you solve the problem of Syria? You've got at least 4 civil wars going on there. You've got the involvement of 5 or 6 powers, Turkey, United States, Russia, Iran. You've got horrible tragedies in terms of the human dimension. You've got rebels there are 100 or more rebel groups. Their ideology is all over the place. It's very hard to identify rebel groups that are for you or against you. Sometimes they're for you and against you the same day. Now, what do you do about that? Well, everybody is dissatisfied with American policy in Syria, including me. It hadn't accomplished much. The place is a total tangled mess. How much money and how many troops are you willing to put in there? Now, what do the critics say? They're not saying put a lot of troops in. Nobody says that. They want to bomb the runways. They want to create a safe zone. They want to have a no-fly zone. They want to provide more humanitarian aid. Now, all of those options create significant problems that are not totally expressed in the press. For example, the no-fly zone, which sounds very attractive, the American military has strongly opposed for months now and told the president, do not do this, because it would take an enormous commitment of American air power and raise the possibility of direct conflict with Russia, among other things. Creating a humanitarian zone, which attracts me a good bit, but I don't know that I fully understand it. If you create a humanitarian zone to try to help relieve the horrible suffering of the Syrian people, it's a very attractive idea, but what does it mean? It means you got to put American troops all around that zone. And you got to keep supplying them. And you got to protect those people. And you own the problem. I'm really puzzled myself just as what to do with Syria, as obviously the president is, and much of the country. It is a very, very complicated, tough problem. Now, everybody favors a political settlement. And I think Secretary Kerry deserves a lot of credit for trying. He hadn't gotten anywhere, or at least not very far, but he's given it a shot. And eventually, at some point, we'll have to get a political solution to that problem. But I don't see the dynamics right now are getting us there, at least for a while, and I'm afraid they're going to have to play out a little further. Personally, I'd be willing to risk something like a humanitarian corridor or zone. The president has rejected that. Now, how many people have been killed in Syria? Hundreds of thousands, and refugees all over the place. Europe destabilized because of it. So this is a really difficult problem. It is so easy to sit down here in Upland, Indiana, at Taylor University, in the presence of the periodic table of the elements chart, and philosophize about Syria. But it is one really difficult problem.
I can't be any more helpful.
Yes, Dr. Jones? Question is about future leaders in the UN, and could the UN be successful or be helpful in a situation like Syria or some of these other trouble spots?
I don't see how the UN right now can be any more helpful than what Lee was describing. Essentially, whatever help they gave would be depend upon us, the United States. And as Lee described it, and I think he did a good job, you have a country that probably at some point, and I can't peg the year, but we're going to redraw the lines. It's going to be a different geography, probably with different sectors of the population in various parts. Now, the dilemma is they still may continue to fight each other. The fact that you sort of straighten out who lives and so forth doesn't mean that they want to live in peace. And as long as that's the case, you keep getting back to the fact that the United States, quite apart from the United Nations, want to go to Syria with enough force to tell all the Syrians to go home and stay home and stop fighting, because we're going to continue to fight them, and because we're determined to govern them and make sure they're peaceful. It's just a predicament for the moment, based partly upon religious fervor, injustices of all sorts, in which these people want to have at it. Now, it's not helped by the fact that the Turks become involved, or quite apart from Iran, or the Russians, or others who see some advantage, taking advantage of this conflict, to sort of exercise their muscle and indicate they've got to be heard. And this complicates even further. I just mentioned the Turks. Here in Iraq, the Kurds were very helpful to the United States by and large, still are really, in trying to straighten out ISIS as it's extended into Iraq. But this drives the Turks absolutely mad, because they believe that the Kurds are, and the PKK, as they call their Kurds, undermine the entire business. So even on the one hand, we're trying to get along with the Turks, on the other hand, trying to get along with the Kurds as we continue to fight in Iraq, and it goes on and on and on in this sort of situation. I don't see a resolution of it, except for the exhaustion, maybe, of some of the tribes, some of the people. Now, they're relieving themselves of the exhaustion by coming to Europe, or to Jordan, or wherever else. They're transferring really all the problems outside of Syria, but the people that are left there finally have to decide whether they're going to live or die. They come to such a point of privation, I suspect, that conceivably peace may come from that difficult situation.
May I just say a word about the United Nations? I'm a supporter of the United Nations. I voted for all of the appropriations. We pay about, 25% of its budget. I'm hugely disappointed in the United Nations. I'm old enough to remember the idealism that attended the creation of the United Nations. It goes beyond the United Nations. It's the international institutions in general, the UN, the WTO, IMF, World Bank, just are not as effective as we need them to be. Now, the United Nations, everybody would say the United Nations needs new leadership, strong leadership. It does. The countries of the world have to provide the United Nations with the resources that it needs. And incidentally, the United Nations does a lot of wonderful things in the world. The last time I counted, they had 16 peacekeeping missions in the world that are doing very valuable work. You don't read about them at all or hear about them, but they're keeping the peace. Now, they failed on all kinds of problems too. So the point I want to make is that we need stronger, more vital, vigorous international institutions. And that means the United States, as part of its leadership, should step up and urge that more than I think we do. But other nations have to come along and do their part too. China and Japan both pay substantial amounts to the United Nations.
Dr. Hoffman.
Can you comment on the degree to which you think the United States was responsible in its policies, especially during the 1990s, for the difficult or bad relations that developed between the U.S. and Russia? For example, critics have said that the expansion of NATO was a big part of the problem. I just wonder if both of you could share your thoughts on the degree to which the U.S. is responsible.
Well, I would comment that in 1991, of course, the Soviet Union failed or collapsed. And the United States really was helpful, it seems to me, throughout that period of the early 90s at least. I was in Russia at least 2 or 3 times a year during that period of time, largely because of the nuclear weapon business, the non-nuclear business. But this took us to other parts of the country and where we saw really how things were going. And there was a reasonable relationship. By that I mean the United States was perceived really as being helpful in many ways, even if we were perceived by some Russians, because, as you say, of the NATO alliance, as not their friend. I think things evolved over the course of that time until Russia felt that it was strong enough to once again assert the old Russia idea. People ask now about Vladimir Putin and the catastrophe of many parts of the Russian economy is suffering because of the drop of the price of oil and other aspects. But his popularity apparently is based, and this is Russian polls essentially, upon the people liking the old Russia, the idea of Stalin, the idea of all the people that used to be a part of that picture, and that he's still pushing for that, even though domestically, in a normal election in this country, he would be doing very poorly as people are unemployed and impoverished and so forth. It's likewise, I remember very sadly, 2012, in my last trip to advocate the non-nuclear program at the War Department, they said, "We don't want you around here anymore. This is it." And they meant it. And by June 2013, the United States was out of it. No more inspections, no more destruction of their weapons and so forth. But until that point of time, there was always the possibility at various points in Russia the United States was perceived as producing employment in a lot of encampments and a lot of other places. I remember, as a matter of fact, the Russian senator trying to get onto our plane, and we took him on one time when I was going out to some encampment there, and he wanted to be identified with the Unlugar program and with disarmament and so forth. But that ended in 2012, 2013. It wasn't just as a matter of being clever about it, but on that day I had a press conference. New York Times was there, but so was Reuters, and so was all the Russian press. And I said, now listen, Russia and the United States have a lot of confidence in each other. We've dealt together on a lot of things. So why don't we, in fact, take out all the chemical weapons in Syria? Real problem for us and for Russia. Well, I didn't hear a whole lot more about it until Putin came forward, as you recall, one day and proposed that that's what we needed to do and said he would support that. And the Russian press came to my new office there at the Lugar Center. And the first question was, are you finally happy they got your idea straight? And of course, I was. I could see that in this particular instance, there was a place where we could cooperate. And Putin saw that, as a matter of fact, too. I think there are still others. Sam Nunn's group, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, has board meetings that I attend, and there are Russians there. We're having pretty good talks with realism about what might happen in the future. But those Russians don't have authority in Russia right now. They did on some occasions in the past. They might in the future. And it's important to keep the conversations up.
Well, you raise a very tough question for me. I supported the expansion of NATO in the 90s, and I've come to think it was a mistake. Some of you know the name Tom Friedman, who writes for the New York Times. Tom and I have had a lot of discussions on this, and he opposed it when it happened. I did not. But he's persuaded me that we should not have done it. What you have to realize is that every action creates counteraction. I don't know who's to blame, but I know that when we move our forces to the Russian border and we put in fancy anti-missile systems, they feel threatened by that. If Russia were to move their forces into the Caribbean and start building fancy anti-missile systems, we'd be pretty doggone upset about it. Now, I don't want to sound too supportive of the Russians here. They're a very tough bunch to deal with. And Putin is an aggressive guy. And they're doing a lot of things we do not like, for sure, including building up their own forces. The only way you sort this thing out is what Dick said. You've got to keep the lines of communication open. And you just got to keep talking and talking with them. And you're not going to make progress for a long period of time, and then suddenly you'll get a break. So the dialogue becomes very, very important, and the kind of conversations Dick and Sam Nunn have had with the Russians are just hugely important, especially at a time when the government-to-government relations are degrading. I don't know how this all shakes out, but I do know that if we do something, they're going to do something. If they do something, we're going to do something. We've been very, very fortunate so far, and we've been lucky on several occasions that this thing hasn't broken out into something really horrible. And I'm not sure we're always going to have that kind of luck. You got to keep the lines of communication as open as you can.
Really enjoyed this, and I'd be interested to hear your comments or your assessment of the current state of religious freedom in the United States.
Of what? Religious freedom?
Yeah, so especially as it comes up against the concern of protect the disenfranchised and vulnerable. And I'm thinking here about things that concern our industry. Our leadership is concerned that it's possible that the federal government may require us to do something that is at odds with our religious convictions. And if we don't do this, it might end up in the loss of funding for students that may very much in institutions. Just think of things that happen in Indiana, South Michigan, the governor's trying to get the religious conservation act, Hobby Lobby situation. Very concerned, at least in our institution, about this. Should we be concerned about this? What's your assessment?
It's too tough for me. I'll let you answer.
Yeah, easier to deal with the Russians.
Yeah.
My own view is that the law that was passed that the governor applauded was a mistake. And this doesn't answer your question, but it was an attempt, I think, that was aggressive on his part or others who were backing that point of view. Immediately, a lot of people came out who are friends of mine, Jim Morris of the Pacers and the head of the Speedway and all the Chamber of Commerce people and so forth, who are very good citizens of Indianapolis and Indiana, and indicated this is disastrous. So then the law is mitigated, amended in various ways that are unsatisfactory to anybody at that point. And I suppose the fact that Governor Pence is off running for vice president has relieved the tension of the thing back here for the moment. Much less comment than if he were running for governor, I suspect, and we were faced with this problem every day. But I would just leave it at that. I think it was something that did not need to be touched, and it was an overdraft on his part.
I agree with what Dick has said. I don't think I can be very helpful to you just because I don't know all that much about it. Look, religious freedom is a terribly important freedom in this country. But it is not without limitation. And anti-discrimination is an important principle of the country too. So these things come into conflict, and sometimes a group will use the tool against the other. I don't know the solution to these problems, but we have to, all of us, be sensitive. I suspect in my case I am not sufficiently sensitive to the problems that you have encountered here because of government action on anti-discrimination basis. So I don't think I can help you very much. It's a very sensitive matter, and all of us have to be tolerant, I think, and try to work through the problems as best we can, upholding our government's general view that you don't discriminate against anybody, but at the same time give them maximum religious freedom. So, not very helpful. Dick's right. The Russians are easier. Yeah. Well, let me begin on just the liberal arts part of it. I am extremely biased at this point. I believe very strongly in a liberal arts education. Now, I understand it's not for everybody. I remember many of my colleagues when I was in college who were dead set on being an engineer, and they took strictly engineering type courses. And there are people like that, and far be it from me to intrude. But if in this country we emphasize in education the STEM courses, science, technology, whatever it is, mathematics, and forget civic education and liberal arts education, we're making a huge mistake. We need people who can think straight, who can write straight, who can take a massive amount of information which is available to all of us now, boil it down, and understand the essentials. And I think you get that in the liberal arts environment. I've talked to a lot of CEOs about this, of very technical companies, and they basically agree that the liberal arts education is very, very valuable. And so I am a strong, strong supporter of liberal arts education. And I commend this university, and we have a number of very fine universities in this state with their emphasis on a liberal education. I suspect my friends who are very scientifically oriented would object to what I've just said, but that's my own bias. I'll give you a personal example. At one time on my staff, I've hired a lot of people, as Dick has too, over a period of years. You know what I look for? Can you write an English sentence? That's what I look for. And I've hired a lot of people who cannot, well, I haven't hired them, I've rejected them because they can't write an English sentence. And I want somebody that can digest all of that information and boil it down for me. At one time, I had on my staff 3 PhDs in philosophy. I was a national hero to the American Philosophical Association. I hired more philosophers than any employer in the United States. Now, why did I hire them? They could think straight. They could write clearly. And they could sift through a lot of information. You get that, I guess, in other fields, but you do it preeminently in the liberal arts. Dick went to Denison. I went to DePaul. Both very good liberal arts schools.
Well, I would just comment that I've served now on the board of trustees at Denison for 50 years. Fortunately, they don't have term limits. Or if they do, they haven't told me yet. But, because I'm very enthusiastic about the liberal arts education that I received there. I studied politics and economics. When I went to Oxford, I did the PPE course, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. I think they're vital, as a matter of fact, to liberal arts. And I think the question, however, at Denison, and this may be the question here ultimately at Taylor, is that they're adding what is now known as the Knowlton Center. Now, the Knowlton Center has a raft of new staff members who are offering counseling and advice to students on potential jobs, professions, where they may be headed, working with students on internships, working with the alumni of Denison to provide many of these opportunities. So they are sharing, literally, the quest of students who love the liberal arts, but understand likewise and some new courses in statistics and in various other aspects of engineering, at least on the side and so forth, have been added to the curriculum. That probably, I think, is prudent on the part of Denison. The enrollment this year is higher than any year in history, and the enthusiasm of parents and students coming to this is obviously higher. But this doesn't knock out for a moment the political science courses. This is really fundamental, and it's a question of supplementing that with practical measures that give confidence to the students and their parents.
Well, Congressman Hamilton and Senator Lugar, thank you again for a good discussion. I'd like to thank everyone for showing up. Let's give them a round of applause.